Today we're going to take a trip through the digestive system. So we will start at the beginning. Food goes into the mouth and is chewed by the teeth. And so this is mechanical digestion. Chewing also serves the purpose of mixing the food with saliva. Saliva contains enzymes which start chemical digestion of the food. And saliva also contains proteins called mucins, which help form the mucus that softens and lubricates the food. So the salivary glands play a very important role here because they are the ones that are making the saliva. And there are 3 pairs of salivary glands. So there's the parotid glands, which are the largest and are located slightly below and in front of the ears. There's the sublingual glands, which are the smallest and are located in the floor of the mouth, and the submandibular glands, which are slightly below and behind the sublingual glands. So these glands are creating the saliva, which contains the enzymes and the mucins, and they send it through ducts from the gland into the mouth to be mixed with the food. Next, the food goes down the tube. In this case, the tube is called the esophagus. And when you swallow food, you want it to go down your esophagus, not down the trachea towards your lungs, because that's how you choke. So food is prevented from entering the trachea by a structure called the epiglottis, which covers the opening to the trachea during swallowing. So that's shown in this video.
This side view of the head highlights structures involved with swallowing. That includes the tongue, teeth, epiglottis, and esophagus. The teeth grind and chop food into tiny pieces, while the glands in the mouth moisten it with saliva. Then the tongue pushes the moistened food, or bolus, to the back of the throat and down into the esophagus, which leads to the stomach. Let's watch the swallowing process again. First, the tongue pushes the food into the throat. Next, the epiglottis, a small but important flap of tissue, folds over the voice box at the top of the windpipe. This keeps food from going down the wrong way. Finally, the esophagus contracts and moves food towards the stomach. Excuse me.
So once the food has entered the esophagus, there are muscles that line the esophagus and they push the food toward the stomach. And this pushing is accomplished by something called peristalsis, which is a series of wavelike muscular contractions and relaxations. So the peristalsis pushes the food down the esophagus, and then before entering the stomach, the food passes through the lower esophageal sphincter. So there's a few sphincters throughout the digestive system, and a sphincter is just a ring of smooth muscle that contracts to close off a passageway, or opens to allow things to go through the passageway. So on the next slide, there's a video that shows how peristalsis works. It also happens throughout the whole digestive system. So the video isn't just showing you what happens in the esophagus, but it's just showing the method of peristalsis.
The autonomic nervous system controls contractions of the alimentary canal that move swallowed food down the esophagus, churn the stomach, and move chyme through the small intestine and large intestine. The alimentary canal is a single continuous tube that includes the oral cavity, esophagus, stomach, and intestines. The tissue layers that form the walls of the tube include 2 layers of smooth muscle. The contraction and relaxation of these muscles is called peristalsis. One peristaltic wave can be enough to move a bolus down the esophagus and into the stomach. In the intestines, the waves are smaller and more regular. As one section of the intestine contracts, the section in front relaxes. This occurs in the rhythmic, wave-like patterns that create the peristalsis that propels substances forward.
So now their food has reached the stomach. And the stomach is a muscular J-shaped stretchable sac that serves three main functions. So it's going to mix and store the food. So there's muscles in the stomach that are working just like the muscles that you just saw in the small intestine. So they're churning the food to physically break it into smaller pieces and mix it with the gastric juices. And this forms a thick liquid called chyme. Next thing that the stomach does is it has secretions that help dissolve and degrade the food, particularly proteins. So these gastric juices contain hydrochloric acid and enzymes. And so, as you're probably familiar with, the stomach is a very acidic environment. And it needs to be of high acidity because that's what activates the enzymes, and it also kills any bacteria that are ingested with your food. So you might think that an acidic environment, well, that's not good for your body. And in general, it's not good for your body. But in the stomach, it works out okay because the stomach lining is protected from that environment by a layer of mucus. And then the last function is that the stomach controls the passage of food into the small intestine. So there's another sphincter. This one is the pyloric sphincter, which is at the base of the stomach, and it controls the movement of chyme into the small intestine. So it'll control the amount that goes each time so that your small intestine isn't overloaded all at once. So now we've reached the small intestine. The small intestine is subdivided into three regions. So there's the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum, and that's their order. So it first goes through the duodenum, then the jejunum, and then the ileum. In the small intestine, what is mostly happening is chemical digestion of the food. So the carbohydrates, the proteins, the lipids are all broken down into their constituent subunits. So they're small enough to then be absorbed into the internal environment. So in the small intestine, there is pancreatic juice that comes from the pancreas. So it is an alkaline solution or basic solution because as the chyme comes into the small intestine, it's going to be acidic, and that would be harmful to the small intestine. So one of the first things that happens is it mixes with this alkaline solution from the pancreas and neutralizes it. The pancreatic juice also contains many digestive enzymes, which are going to be acting on the food. The other thing that's happening in the small intestine is that there is bile being released into it. So, bile is produced by the liver and it's stored in the gallbladder and then released into the small intestine. And bile's role is to break up the insoluble fat globules contained in the chyme into tiny fat droplets. So then those tiny fat droplets can be acted on by enzymes. So if you've ever mixed oil and water, you know that one, they don't mix, but you know that oil clumps up, right? So, and fats do that. So within the digestive system, any fats that you eat are going to form into clumps and they're not going to want to break apart, which means enzymes aren't going to be able to get at them. So bile's job is to break those big fat globules into little fat droplets, which can then be broken down by enzymes. The second key thing that happens in the small intestine, so the first was digestion, so the second is absorption. The vast majority of nutrients are being absorbed from the small intestine. So absorption is the passage of nutrients through a layer of cells into the body's tissues. Once the molecules are absorbed, they are then assimilated, which means they become part of the tissues of the body. The walls of the small intestine have a structure that maximizes the surface area where the absorption can occur. And so it does this in sort of three main ways. So first, the inner mucosa, which is the lining of the small intestine, is folded, right? So there's a bunch of folds, which increases the surface area. Next, along those folds, there are astounding numbers of these minute, visible finger-like projections called villi. And third, the cells at the surface of the villi have fine thread-like projections of their cell membrane called microvilli. So all these things put together create a huge surface area for all the nutrients to be absorbed into the body. So this diagram shows that. So there's the cross section of the small intestine. And so you can see here that it's folded. So there's a big fold shown there. And then along that big fold are all tiny little folds. Those are the villi. Okay, so those are the villi. And then along the villi, there are epithelial cells. And if you look closely at the epithelial cells, they all have microvilli. So it's really like folds upon folds upon folds, right? So there's a humongous surface area there for absorbing nutrients. So now we have reached the large intestine. So the indigestible parts of food, together with a large volume of water, now moves into the large intestine. The large intestine has a few different parts. So there's the cecum, the colon, which itself has four parts: the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and the sigmoid colon. And then you have the rectum and the anal canal. And then the appendix hangs off of the cecum, and the appendix doesn't have a role in digestion, but it's generally included as part of the digestive system. So there are billions of anaerobic bacteria that live in the colon, and they help to break down undigested material further. And some of these bacteria produce important vitamins, which are then absorbed into the bloodstream. The main job of the large intestine is to absorb water. So water is absorbed out of the undigested material, and then the damp mass that remains at the end is called feces, which passes into the rectum and anal canal, where it is stored. It then passes out of the body through the anus, which has rings of circular muscle called the anal sphincter. So that's our other sphincter that's part of the digestive system. So that is the end of our voyage through the digestive system.